Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University. I'm John Levison. I'm director of the Mandel Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our session today. We encourage you to take a look at the Mandel Center events page to learn about our other events, our upcoming events. We are delighted to have so many of you joining us live, and we hope to take some of your questions as we go. So feel free to post those questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll keep an eye on those. We're also recording today's session, and we'll make the recording available afterwards on our website and our YouTube channel, our podcast, all of those opportunities. And you should certainly subscribe to those. Our guest today is my friend and colleague, Anastasia Badder. Anastasia is an anthropologist of religion. She earned her doctorate at the University of Luxembourg, and she is currently a research associate at the University of Cambridge. And I invited Anastasia to talk with me today about an article that she published in the journal Contemporary Jewry with the title, "When a Yarmulke Stands for All Jews, Navigating Shifting Signs from Synagogue to School in Luxembourg." And there's a link to that article as well in the chat. Anastasia, welcome. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. I want to start, as I always do, I want to start by asking you to give us the backstory for this research. How did you decide you wanted to study the community in Luxembourg? And tell us also a little bit about your methodology. How did you actually undertake this study?
Sure. So this is a little bit of a long story, but I'll try to keep it brief. But I think the context is sort of important to understand how I got there. So I'm an anthropologist of religion. And for my MA, which I completed in Auckland, New Zealand, I tried to understand what it means to be Jewish, and especially how Jewish young adults see Jewishness in New Zealand society. And for that project, I explored a lot of different facets of Jewishness with this group. And one thing I found, but that I didn't really get to fully unpack in that thesis, was that Hebrew played a really important role for a lot of people. People talked about having an inherent ability to learn Hebrew. They talked about Hebrew as something inherited. They talked about the feeling of Hebrew immersion. And they spoke about Hebrew as something that really contained Jewish culture. And more, this really piqued my interest in the role of language in Jewish life, and also language in kind of moments of encounter. And then when I was looking for a PhD program, I learned about this really fascinating program just being launched in Luxembourg, that brought together 10 PhDs from 10 different disciplines to look at questions of linguistic diversity, especially in kind of educational contexts. So I applied. I did not think I was going to get this job because they really required a lot of language knowledge, the local languages and so on, which I definitely didn't have. But in the end, they offered me this role. And so I accepted. And I was actually meant to be looking at children whose families come to Luxembourg and who learn the local languages before their parents and kind of act as these cultural mediators. But this really being my first time in Europe for an extended period, more and more I was asking myself, well, what is it actually like to be Jewish here? Where is the Jewish community? What's going on? And it seemed especially interesting to me because Luxembourg at the time, it's a historically very Catholic country, and Catholicism is really baked into social and even political life. And at the time, they were just starting to talk about secularizing. So I thought, this is something big is kind of coming. This is a super interesting moment to be trying to understand Jewishness here. Luckily, I had an amazing supervisor. And when I said I wanted to move in that direction, she was really supportive. So I started basically just going to 2 different shuls in Luxembourg, and also to Chabad events, and trying to just get a lay of the land and get to know people. And initially, I thought that I would look at maybe something to do with language and multilingualism, maybe as related to security or memory, something along those lines. But just by chance, as often happens in ethnography, the rabbi at the liberal shul asked if I would be willing to help teach Talmud Torah. And so, the synagogue, it's pretty newly liberal, they're under-resourced, and they were having a hard time finding volunteers. So even though it kind of contradicted what I at the time imagined to be this kind of classic ethnographer role, I accepted. I said, sure, let's do it.
And you
And
had
then
a background in early childhood education, right?
exactly. So I've spent a couple of years as an early childhood educator, and I have I did some study there as well. So, I think that's part of what led him to ask me. But I am really glad that I agreed because it led me down this super interesting research path. And I started asking myself, okay, there's a really big emphasis here on being liberal, on being progressive, on being mobile, very cosmopolitan. And I wondered, actually, what does liberal mean here? What is it doing? And how do children learn what it means to be liberal? How do they take that up?
Right.
And one thing I noticed was that this was playing out in a big way through Hebrew language learning, which I've written about elsewhere, but it also played out in the ways they engage the material world.
Okay, so we're
And
going to come to that. And I just want to notice the way that you're zeroing in on the feeling of being a liberal Jew,
Mhm,
which distinguishes me from, on the one hand, my Catholic friends, colleagues, other Luxembourgians, and
mhm.
also distinguishes me from other parts of the Jewish community, from more traditional parts of the community. And just a couple of sentences about how do you actually do the work of ethnography? What does that look like?
So basically, it looks like a lot of hanging out. You sort of spend a lot of time socializing, talking to people, going to services, going to social events, going to, events that you think that people from the community will be at or that they're inviting you to. And also really kindly, a lot of the families from the Talmud Torah invited me to come to their schools as well, to their secular schools. All of the students, there's no Jewish day school in Luxembourg, so all of the students from the Talmud Torah, they attend secular schools.
Yeah,
And yeah, so ethnography is
and taking
basically,
lots and lots of notes.
yes, taking tons of notes, tons of notes. I did a couple of interviews as well, um, and some of these kind of more formal, research techniques, but it's primarily this really social process of just building relationships, spending time with people.
Great. Okay, so now I want to pull back and ask you about the main argument of this paper, this particular paper. The stuff about Hebrew and the role of Hebrew, it's incredibly interesting, and I certainly I've heard you present on it elsewhere,
Mm.
and our audience should definitely learn more about that. But for this paper, what's your at the 30,000 foot level? What do you want people to know about what you observed among these kids and families?
So I think there's kind of two things that I would want people to take away from this. First is that these families are really dedicated to their vision of Jewish continuity and community, but they're also very much trying to work out what that means when you're hypermobile, when you also imagine yourself as kind of very modern and progressive. And when the community that you join is, in many cases, the default option because there's only one non-Orthodox community. And it might look very different from the community you were previously part of. So it's really this process of ongoing negotiation, of figuring out things on the go, and kind of hoping that the future you envision for yourself and for your children is achievable.
So,
Um,
can you say more about this idea of mobility? So, these are folks who did not grow up in Luxembourg, right? Did any of them, or they're all expats from someplace else?
So there was at the time when I was there, there were a couple of Luxembourgers in the who were members of the community, but who didn't have children, nobody who had children in the Talmud Torah.
So can you say more about mobility? Why is, and because this certainly comes up in your analysis, it's so central to not just how they think about themselves, about what they want for their children. Why is mobility so significant for them?
So I think for these families, I mean, they were all already very sort of socially mobile when they arrived in Luxembourg. As you note, none of them were themselves Luxembourgish. Most people were there for work, and they envisioned that Luxembourg was a kind of stopover. So they, or at least their children, would certainly continue to move. And in some way, this was practical. The reality of a lot of the work that they do, it requires movement. And for their children, for instance, there's only one university in Luxembourg. So if you want any kind of other options, you're going to have to travel. They also have friends and family all over the world. They have very sort of far-flung social networks, and they traveled a lot for leisure. But I think it was also existential in a sense. So this was for them really how they envisioned the modern world, this very kind of connected global place, people crossing, moving, on the move, very much so. And so being mobile was a key part of being in and being part of that world. And that also included making sure that you could be sort of Jewishly mobile, if we want to phrase it like that. So it's not about sort of abandoning Jewishness in any way, but about making sure you could carry it along with you and live it out in the way that you desire wherever you end up.
Right. And well, I'm sure we'll circle back to this. Because this idea of mobility, what you found is this idea of mobility is so important, and we can understand it because the adults, the grown-ups themselves had moved, and they didn't necessarily see long-term necessarily futures for themselves, their children, in this community. I also imagine you also mentioned the kinds of work that they do. So this is they are professionals. There's also a class issue here. They're imagining
Definitely.
traveling for pleasure, for family, for education. That's all part of sort of baked into how they think about the world. And that also is all how they think about Judaism. That Judaism has to be the kind of thing that enables them to do it. So we're going to circle back to that in a moment. But before we do that, in this particular article, you write about what you call, and others call, a material approach to religion, a material approach to the study of religion. So I want to understand more about what a material approach to religion is, help our audience understand that more. And how is that different from other ways of studying religion? What does it help you to see or understand that maybe some other approach might not see?
Sure. I'm speaking sort of as an anthropologist here. So anthropology as a discipline has, of course, long been concerned with religion and religious life. But for a lot of its history, anthropology took religion as primarily a matter of belief, as this sort of internally held propositional thing, and very ephemeral, very, kind of immaterial, and maybe also with some emphasis on kind of written or spoken word. But now we recognize in anthropology that this is a really narrow understanding of religion that actually doesn't reflect how religion is lived for a lot of people. And actually, that this notion of religion as a category comes out of a long kind of Protestant inflected legacy. So if anyone is interested, Talal Asad is a really great scholar to start to explore this further. And then really in the last maybe decade or two, anthropologists have started pushing back against that approach to also explore embodied practices, material engagements, really showcasing the ways and the context in which material things also play a really crucial role in religious life, the ways they support religious feelings, the ways they can really act powerfully or be powerful holders of meaning, help cultivate connections, belongings, community, and so on. So a material approach is really about acknowledging and even focusing on those material elements of religious life. It's about sort of recognizing that the things that people engage in their religious life world aren't neutral things. They're not just kind of along for the ride. They also play really important roles. They do things, they enable or preclude certain things, relationships, and so on.
Great.
Um,
So for example, if we imagine a yarmulke or a kippah, it might be taken as as a kind of a stand-in for a belief.
mhm.
Certainly, I'm sure you've heard people say, "Well, what is it? Why do people wear a yarmulke? What does it mean?" It means
Yeah.
I don't know, recognizing that there's a divinity above you or something like that, right? But a material approach to religion say, well, it's not that that's wrong. It's just that that's not complete about all the things that wearing yarmulke, not wearing yarmulke, receiving all the things that that means for folks.
Mhm.
And here we get to, I want to ask you more about this one with this one particular boy, Leo, because it's in some ways it's the heart for me, the heart of the article, because you tell the story about Leo and you kind of follow him into his public school classroom. So this is a boy that you know from the Talmud Torah, from the supplementary school, the Jewish setting, but you follow him into the public school. And I don't remember if he's the only Jew, but one of the only Jews in that setting.
Yeah.
And when that classroom learns about Judaism in a kind of study of religion, in a session or a few sessions about the study of religion, the question comes up, why doesn't Leo look Jewish? Because he doesn't wear a yarmulke, but the people in the pictures, and there's also a gender component here, but anyway, the people in the pictures that the teacher is showing, they quote look Jewish. They're wearing yarmulke. So tell us more about Leo and then what the yarmulke means for him.
Sure. So yeah, exactly as you said, Leo was in that class. He was the only known to be Jewish student. There was one other student whose family was Jewish, but who hadn't shared that information with his classmates, and actually identified himself as atheist in the classroom. So Leo was kind of taken as this representative of Jewishness in the classroom. And what was really interesting was that what he understood about the yarmulke and what it does, especially in public spaces, he found that that really did not at all align with what it was taken to mean in that classroom. So for him and his Talmud Torah classmates, the image of Jewishness that was being shown in that secular classroom was one of religious Jews, and that's not how they saw themselves. And they really associated the kind of public wearing of the yarmulke with this kind of religiousness, with this level of observance. And it was precisely actually that kind of Jewishness that they positioned themselves against as kind of liberal, progressive Jews. But suddenly in the classroom, that image of Jewishness, mostly men in the pictures, wearing yarmulkes, were taken to represent all Jews, including Leo. And his classmates, it was confusing for Leo, but it was also confusing for his classmates who were unfamiliar with Jewishness and who were kind of receiving this as the image of Jewishness. So, students were asking, oh, why didn't Leo look like this? Did his dad look like this? Why not? And some of them even started to wonder, were Leo and his family doing Jewishness wrong? Um, and this was really interesting. One classmate said to Leo, well, if you don't follow the rules, you go to hell. And this was like a really striking moment for me of this kind of conflict of meanings and presentations. So the material presence and absence of the yarmulke was doing some really powerful work here. Um,
Yeah. So poor Leo, right? Like, well, he doesn't deserve this. How old was he? About 10? Was that my?
so he was 10 at that time, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. So, he's going through the world. He's trying to make sense of things. Maybe he has a sense of kind of the diversity of the Jewish community, but all of a sudden, this marker of Judaism now becomes a kind of point of alienation. Like, wait,
Mhm.
that's not me. And they're all seeing that as being a marker of Judaism. And in fact, now there's blowback because these people, you know, what do they know about Judaism? They just saw 3 pictures and now all of a sudden they're experts and they're
Yeah.
telling me I'm going to hell, right? So, and he has to kind of navigate this space, which also raises really interesting questions for me about when we talk about the secularity or the neutrality of a public school space. um, it's not that the teacher was picking on Leo, um, but there is religion in that space. There are understandings of religion that permeate that space and that have implications for for the students. how do you think about the kind of the secularity of schools and the place of religion within that secularity?
So, I mean, this is the big question. So, schools in Luxembourg are, or this school, it's technically secular, but all schools in Luxembourg, until just before this study, still included, they had to include catechism class. So, religion, especially Catholicism, is very much floating around, it's in the atmosphere. But equally, I think Christian understandings of religion very much inform how religion is talked about, how it's envisioned, and how it's taught in the classroom. Um, and there's this idea that I think we see in a lot of kind of world religions lessons that all religions are kind of comparable. You know, if you know the model for religion, you can understand all religions, and the model looks very much like Christianity.
Mhm.
And so I think that really informed what was going on in this space. So even though the classroom is technically secular, I think, you know, in the background, certainly these kind of very particular understandings of religion inform what's going on, what's taught, the kind of images that are chosen, the kind of discourse, you know, around non-Christian religions. Yeah, I think it's a
Right.
very strong presence.
And we can imagine that the teacher showing images of religion, well, if you're going to try and introduce, let's say, mostly non-Jews to what Judaism is, it doesn't help to show somebody who looks exactly like them. It doesn't help. I mean, you can understand the thought process by which the instructor says, I want to show somebody that, quote, looks Jewish. I want to show the symbols of religion. So I will show somebody who looks Hasidic, right? And I will, if I'm doing Islam, I'm going to show somebody who looks Muslim. I'm going to show a woman hijab or something like that. Without, you know, there's nobody was intending to beat up on poor Leo, but the implication is you don't stack up to that paradigm because you're not sufficiently different, right? Like
Yes.
the work of difference, there's real work that the difference does here.
Absolutely. And yeah, and you know, this isn't meant to be like an indictment on this teacher. I think actually, I think actually he thought that by inviting Leo to speak, he was sort of, you know, making space for Leo's identity in the classroom and so on. But of course, in practice, you know, something different kind of happens.
Right. Can we talk about gender for a second? Because
Sure.
obviously by talking about yarmulke, you are focusing yarmulke as a head covering primarily for boys and men. Obviously, there are exceptions, but even the liberal community, the when women wear a kippah or a yarmulke, it tends to be only in private, or in not necessarily private, but in Jewish spaces. So the yarmulke is religious attire, but then we've got head coverings for traditional Jewish women, and you make this really interesting point that the head coverings that Jews might recognize as religiously motivated or aspects of religious identification for Jewish women, whether it's a headscarf or even a beret, we might say,
Mhm.
"Oh yeah, I get it. Why she's wearing a beret." Um, but those aren't coded as Jewish for a non-Jewish population. So that's a really fascinating dynamic that you call our attention to. So how do you think that affects how people think about Jews and Judaism or think about head covering?
So, I mean, this was so interesting to me on several levels. So, one thing I found, as you say, that was really notable was that even the Talmud Torah students in this liberal shul were not so familiar with the variety of women's head coverings. On the rare occasions, they might see a woman wearing a yarmulke, um, you know, maybe in the shul, and it would certainly spark some discussion amongst them, but they wouldn't be likely to note a beret, or any kind of other head covering as necessarily distinctly Jewish, in the way that they would a yarmulke. Those things might not even catch their attention necessarily. And there was very little talk overall about women's dress in this group. Um, and I think the other thing that's really interesting about this is that it's so different from discussions we see, for example, about different forms of Muslim dress, where the focus is almost entirely on women's dress, and the tenor of public discussion is really heated and often quite problematic. And I think there's a lot we could unpack there. I think it says something about potentially the racialization of religion and also the inverse of that. And yeah, so I think there's something really interesting going on there. But to answer your question about how it affects people, speaking for how it affects my liberal students, I actually wonder if it reaffirms the idea that many of them seem to have that women are left out of observant life.
Hmm.
And I also wonder how that might align with another kind of related notion a lot of them held, that women are disadvantaged somehow by observant life. So it doesn't appear to them when or what, or that women may dress in Orthodox presenting ways. If it doesn't appear to them as something, women might be doing, the implication is that, well, kind of what are women doing in observant life? We can't spot them. We don't know what they're doing. Maybe they don't play a role. Maybe they're being backgrounded and so on. So I wonder if that kind of, actually feeds into some of those ideas that they had about observant life and women's roles.
Right, right. And part of the importance of the material study of religion, a generation, at least a generation now of anthropology of religion, is to disrupt some of those assumptions and to call attention to the variety of ways that women may be participating in non-elite religion, in spaces that aren't sort of official or are less called attention to by in official texts, and the material culture that goes along with that, which is obviously as rich as all of human culture, and to see women's participation and women's roles and women's activism in ways that weren't previously seen, and by people following Talal Asad, like Saba Mahmoud, for example, comes to mind. As an example here. We're almost out of time. The time always goes really, really quickly, but I want to turn to the final question that I always ask, which is, what do you think that Jewish educators should learn from your work about how these young Jews in this particular community think about, relate to a public symbol like a yarmulke? I should also mention, I should have mentioned this before, but all of this research took place before October 7th. And there's no question that the public display of religion has been an issue for a long, long time. But the work, the data that you collected, the observations were already a couple of years ago. But still, why does this research matter?
So I think there are maybe two kind of related things that matter, or that maybe we can take away from this research. So first, we can see that things, material things, and what they do, and their many possible meanings, differ across diverse contexts. And as students move through those various contexts of their everyday lives, they're going to be encountering those kind of multiple complex possibilities. And they'll be making connections across them as well. So what they learn about things like the yarmulke in one space will inform or shape what they learn and how they make sense of those things in another context. And ignoring those kinds of possibilities and connections, I think does have consequences for classroom experience, maybe for students' well-being and belonging, maybe even for learning outcomes. And so just keeping those in mind might be something that could help us support students better. And I think relatedly, this also points us towards the question of how we know and how students come to know about things like yarmulkes and even more broadly about Jewishness. So we can see that maybe there are different ways of knowing, and this maybe invites us to reflect on the kinds of epistemological gaps between maybe different classrooms or just the different spaces that students move through. Right. So across different contexts, there are different hows in addition to different whats. So not only what do we know about yarmulkes, but how do we know about them? How do we build knowledge about them? So yeah, in this case, Leo and his Talmud Torah classmates were learning about yarmulkes in a number of ways, in embodied ways as part of this kind of material ritual assemblage, in discursive ways as part of talk about being religious, um, as something that could be more or less visibly produced. And then in the secular classroom, they were learning about yarmulkes primarily as a sign of Judaism, really broadly, in this kind of ways that dissociates knowledge from embodied being and acting. So yes, I think this research also reminds us that students are grappling with these kinds of different ways of knowing. And, maybe again, just attending to that can help us better support students.
Right. Yeah, no, thank you. I love that. And it makes me realize that, I was thinking about this, my shorthand for your study is that you had studied these kids in Talmud Torah, but of course that's not right. What you actually did was you followed these kids in multiple settings in order to actually see, as you said, the different inputs, both about what they learn and also how they learn about the
Mhm.
meanings of these things, because these are the real lives that these kids live and all kids live, right? They don't stay in one space. They have multiple spaces that they navigate, and they make meaning by weaving together all those spaces and all of the inputs from all those spaces. Anastasia, thank you so much for being with us. It's great to talk with you about your work. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I encourage everyone to check out the Mandel Center events page to learn about our other upcoming events, subscribe to our YouTube channel and our podcast. Our next event will be a Learning About Learning session, just like this one, with Tali Zelkowitz about her recently published essay called Using Both and Thinking to Repair a Rift in Jewish Education. And that's coming up on February 27th. Thank you again, Anastasia. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Take care.